Good evening, everyone. Those who are here and those who are watching online. Welcome to tonight's talk by Jean-Thomas Tremblay. My name is Kanika Anand and I'm the Senior Curator here at Contemporary Calgary. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening and share a few notes on the topic of this talk. First, a brief introduction. Jean-Thomas Tremblay is Assistant Professor of Environmental Humanities at York University in Toronto. He is the author of Breathing Aesthetics, and with Stephen Swarbrick, a co-author of the forthcoming Negative Life, The Cinema of Extinction, which will be published this year. Early last year, we invited Amanda Kasia to curate an exhibition in parallel with the Special Olympics that are being hosted in Calgary, in fact, opening next week. Amanda's exhibition, Resistance and Respiration, is inspired by the scholarship of breathing aesthetics, in which Tremblay argues that difficult breathing indexes the uneven distribution of risk in a contemporary era marked by the increasing contamination, weaponization, and monetization of air. The book identifies responses to the crisis in breathing in aesthetic practices, ranging from the film work of Cuban-American artist Ana Mendieta to the disability diaries of Bob Flanagan. Tonight's talk is titled Aesthetic Self-Medication, Bob Flanagan and Sheree Rose's Sick Art. This talk tracks adaptations to changing respiratory conditions in the performance art and life writing of Bob Flanagan and Sheree Rose. In so doing, the talk tells a story about the ways breathing as an aesthetic practice gets caught up in breathing as an ordinary or exceptional effect of disability over the course, and in Rose's case, in the aftermath of Flanagan's experience with cystic fibrosis. I'd like to welcome Jean-Thomas and thank you again for being here with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here in person and online. I'm super grateful for this invitation to speak in the context of resistance and respiration. A few people deserve special thanks: the exhibition's curator, Amanda Kasia, and here at Contemporary Calgary, Kanika Anand, Sarah Philpott, and also Victoria Cimolini. You've made the visit very smooth, and it's been so inviting. I'm very happy to be here. It feels like a kind of mythical space. Whenever I watch a movie and someone gives a talk in a museum or at a school and the auditorium is like spectacular, I think like that's not what a museum auditorium looks like, but in this case it does. So I'm really excited. So tonight I'll be presenting some work from my first book, Breathing Aesthetics, which came out just a year and a half ago, and it served as an inspiration for this exhibition. I've picked and slightly adapted a chapter section on Bob Flanagan and Sheree Rose, two artists who are featured in the show. Flanagan was born in 1952 and died in 1996, and Rose was born in 1941, and she's still living and still a prolific artist. Breathing Aesthetics feels rather far behind. I finalized the edits almost 3 years ago, and I've concentrated on other projects that are mostly unrelated to respiration. So I really value this opportunity to revisit those ideas in your company. My talk is titled Aesthetic Self-Medication, Bob Flanagan and Sheree Rose's Sick Art. Okay. Breathing is often implicit. We don't necessarily notice it, let alone think about its life-giving and life-sustaining functions. Not minding our breathing has its benefits. Insofar as it goes unnoticed, breathing supports a tacit structure of experience that equips us with a sense of ownership over our sensations, thoughts, and actions. This is what Jacques Derrida and others term autoaffection, and what Drew Leader terms self-effacing transitivity. As an exchange between bodies and milieus that enables experience but stays muted or hidden, non-conscious breathing is an even better example of autoaffection than Derrida's analogues of choice, hearing ourselves and, via Jean-Luc Nancy, touching ourselves. Didier Anzur's psychoanalytic theory of the skin ego similarly posits that non-conscious respiration, more precisely the non-conscious respiration and perspiration of our skin, guarantees our somatic integrity or holds us. According to another psychoanalyst, Michael Balin, the way we come to see ourselves as vulnerable to our environments mimics the way we become conscious of our breathing. The emergence of primary objects, that is, children's transition from the undifferentiated environment of interpenetrating mix-up to cathexis toward caregivers, approximates the process through which approximates the process through which the air we breathe imposes itself as an object. We notice the sustenance it provides when it is not readily available. In health-related or environmental crises, or in situations of exertion or shock, becoming conscious of our breathing confronts us with the possibly panic-inducing fact that respiration has already been going on, indifferent to our awareness of it. As breathers, we take in particles that are nourishing and toxic, often beyond discernment. When being conscious of our breathing implies being conscious of our vulnerability or exposure to risk, we must perform breathing as a gesture that no longer feels natural. It seems forced, off-pitch. Yet, we would be wrong to infer that a consciousness of breathing is never desirable. Breath's entry into the realm of consciousness can register as a disorganizing event, surely, but also as an occasion for self-management. Meditation explicitly encourages a consciousness of breathing. Mindful breathing cultivates a sensitivity to surrounding energy in hopes of producing an alignment between self, body, and milieu. It capitalizes on the fact that breathing, as Elo Arani-Fardenberg puts it, tells us that we are and are not captains of our fate. A comprehensive overview of the scientific literature on yogic breathing reports that pranayama practices have been found to influence the neurocognitive abilities, autonomic and pulmonary functions, and biochemical and metabolic activities. The advantages of slow, regular respiration demonstrated by pranayama practices shouldn't distract us from the occasional allure of breathlessness, a mode of breathing rather than its negation. Sex may be breathless, an aesthetic encounter may be breathtaking, suspense may lead subjects to hold their breath. As an outcome of crises across scales, in mindfulness exercises, or in non-fatal instances of breathlessness, conscious respiration brings up the question of how to secure some sense that we are in control of our bodies and able to intervene in our environments despite our openness or through our receptivity. The artistic practices to which I turn in this talk come into play once a breach in autoaffection has occurred and individuals cannot or can no longer ignore their breathing. Here I investigate scenes where breathing has imposed itself as an object in the Ballantian sense, and artists must learn to live with the disturbance by developing new practices of attention and modes of writing. I tell a story then about the ways breathing as an ordinary or exceptional affective crisis gets entangled with breathing as an aesthetic tactic or strategy. The artistic notation of breathing for therapeutic purposes corresponds to what I term aesthetic self-medication. Some of the crisis breathing described in my talk falls under the rubric of disability. Flanagan lived with and died of cystic fibrosis. Practices of aesthetic self-medication are not reducible to the medically sanctioned cures that, according to Alison Kafer, align with a pathological model of disability, regardless of their desirability. Still, Flanagan and Rose borrow from medical codes and procedures, including the doctor-patient dynamic and the symptomatology template. Their medical performances, as Petra Cooper calls them, rearrange without rejecting a medical system of reference. Medicine is for them not the domain that Nirmala Aravelas claims is antipodal to actual embodied experience. Instead, medicine is a sensory and sensual realm for negotiating self-presence and personality. I recognize a certain risk in calling something a crisis in breathing and locating it in the vicinity of disability, and that risk is that of subsuming disability ordinaries into a state of emergency. My point isn't that disability is crisis, but as Martha Russell and Ravi Malhotra also propose, that persons with disabilities disproportionately bear the weight of capitalism and the environmental collapse it has engendered. The economic system induces crises to exclude persons with disabilities from the workforce in the absence of a welfare state, and also from the realm of security and protection. The unaffordability of medical treatments forced Flanagan into a crisis state. At the time of Flanagan's death, he and Rose could no longer afford to live. They had accumulated debt and had been struggling to obtain adequate financial compensation for their performances and installations. In footage of a show, Flanagan tells a visitor that Medi-Cal, which was California's healthcare program, doesn't cover lung transplants, and that doctors at the Stanford Medical Center consider his lungs too scarred for experimental treatment. Flanagan says, "Life is my full-time job and the pay stinks." Flanagan and Rose display a psychic disorganization that is marked by loss. What Flanagan mourns is not the imaginary non-disabled self to be rehabilitated that Kiefer associates with nostalgic narratives of disability. Instead, he mourns a particular genre of or set of affective expectations toward pain. His loss is symptomatized and provisionally remedied through breathing. And provisionally here is the key word. Flanagan and Rose live and write with conscious breathing as a kind of performance technique. Performance, a formation closely linked to 1960s radicalism, stages corporeal positions and gestures such that patterns of stillness and movement become techniques. Performance artists have used breathing to dramatize the interplay between abandonment and control, between their exposure to risk or receptivity to stimuli in a life setting, and their control as initiators of an artistic act. Athleticism, as Jennifer Doyle uses the term, refers to artistic, recreational, and sports-related practices of the self that constitute physical exploits. When such exploits necessitate stamina and sustained focus, performances tend to be durational, meaning that their form and signification hinge on their long duration. Performances count as endurance art when, as Martin O'Brien writes, they offer a way of persisting through an experience of sufferance or difficulty. Text here isn't the antithesis of performance or ritual. Text arises from deliberate techniques or improvised gesture. Okay, enough throat clearing. I'll turn now to Flanagan's and Rose's works. Breathing is seldom the first thing that critics and art enthusiasts mention when they discuss Flanagan and Rose. Statements with and about shock value are more common. Statements like Rosemary Garland Thompson's oft-cited descriptor for Flanagan, the artist famous for pounding a nail through his penis in one of his performances. Flanagan was a masochist. He and Rose met in 1980, at a Halloween party. She was dressed as Jane Mansfield, and he was dressed as a character from Night of the Living Dead, two dead figures. Shortly after their meet-cute, Flanagan and Rose began to live in what they call a full-time slave-mistress relationship. He submitted to her by cooking, cleaning the house, running errands, and forfeiting dominance over their sex life. For Rose, who before meeting Flanagan had transitioned from stay-at-home wife and mother to icon of Los Angeles' 1970s underground punk scene, the BDSM lifestyle offered a feminist riff on heterosexual domesticity. Flanagan idealized himself as super masochist, an ironic superhero who bore pain better than those phonies who could take anything they told you to do, as equipped in his song Smartass Masochist. Masochist was not the only label Flanagan claimed. Sick proved equally important. Flanagan, as I've mentioned, had cystic fibrosis. CF is marked by an abnormal production of mucus that clogs the lungs. The lack of oxygen causes depletion in the blood and the brain, such that people who suffer from this hereditary disorder ultimately drown in their secretion. Flanagan and Rose titled one of their shows Bob Flanagan's Sick. Kirby Dick later borrowed the term for the 1997 documentary Sick, The Life and Death of Bob Flanagan, Super Masochist, which relies heavily on footage that was shot by Rose herself. The word sick suggests physical illness as well as deviance and perversion. Visiting Hours, a museum piece presented at the Santa Monica Museum of Art in 1992 and at the New Museum in New York City in 1994, explicitly conflated CF and sadomasochism, or SM. The piece included a room modeled on a medical clinic and a wall made of 1,400 alphabet blocks spelling BOB, SM, and CF. Through a system of ropes and pulley, Rose sporadically lifted Flanagan, his ankles strapped into a harness, above the hospital bed on which he otherwise sat all day. The act gave Flanagan a spatially but not affectively uplifting break from his stasis. The convoluted scene both amplified his suffering and foregrounded the strength and dedication of Rose's support. Like their endurance performances, the elevation in Visiting Hours required controlled breathing on the part of both artists. Lifting a body necessitates strength, and hanging upside down, a dizzying act, necessitates calm and stamina. Flanagan and Rose had to train themselves to breathe the way athletes would. Controlled breathing was how Flanagan conveyed a receptivity that turned him into the all-powerful supermasochist. It was also how Rose conveyed a control that turned her into a kind of hyper-attuned magician's assistant. In breathing, contractual submission and domination easily flow into one another. This is why Flanagan confesses, "I'm ultimately, and this is what every masochist hates to hear or admit, in full control." Scholars of performance and disability studies have written extensively about Flanagan and Rose's BDSM relationship and extreme performance practice. Garland Thompson explains that Flanagan's performances exemplify disability autobiography, a genre of visual and narrative self-presentation that intervenes in the social construction of disability identity. Renate Lorenz and Cooper separately observe that Flanagan publicizes the pain of SM and the pain of sickness as interconnected but not interchangeable. Dwelling on the convergence of disability and erotic fantasy, Robert McCruer argues that Flanagan and Rose's work is transgressive precisely because it flirts with the co-optation of disability. Linda Kaufman, for her part, claims that Flanagan's didactic, step-by-step exposition of the reorganization of human senses by technology makes him a live model for the post-human. This scholarship tends to simplify Flanagan and Rose's life and work by making torture and suffering politically straightforward and thus less threatening to spectators. If we bracket Kaufman, who provides a technogenetic account of embodiment, the scholars I've cited share an interest in the ways Flanagan resignifies and reclaims his disabled body. But casting Flanagan's body as the one to be resignified and reclaimed erases Rose's feminist politics. Moreover, critics have largely overlooked the transformation of Flanagan and Rose's life and work once the positions of supermasochist and Mistress Rose became impossible to sustain. I understand their later work as the result of a shift in respiratory aesthetics, a shift away from the mix of controlled breathing and ecstatic breathlessness of BDSM performance, and toward the labored breathing of CF in lived experience and its memorialization. Flanagan's solo journals telegraph first his coming of age as a masochistic performer, and then his coming to terms with a diminished ability to control his breathing. 2 of Flanagan's journals have been published. The other documents that I labeled journals are sustained writing practices in notebooks and on loose leaves of paper that can be found generally incomplete and haphazardly across Flanagan and Rose's 2 archival collections, which are housed by separate institutions. One massive journal from the late 1970s, just before Flanagan and Rose met, shows us a pre-supermasochist Flanagan who had yet to develop techniques of controlled breathing through performance. Another project undertaken in the mid-80s is an epistolary journal, a series of dated letters addressed to Rose. These letters catalog the temporary relief from shallow breathing offered by medical treatments and a tattooing session that feels like inhaling pure oxygen. Like all volumes published by Hanuman Books, Flanagan's first published diary, which is called Fuck Journal from 1987, comes in the shape of a tiny prayer manual. The journal records in all caps Flanagan's and Rose's sex life through the year 1986. Entries blend tales of erotic asphyxiation with Flanagan's realization that he's otherwise increasingly not breathing well, and also decreasingly willing to submit to Rose. Another unpublished journal, written the same year, constitutes a depressive counterpart to the high-octane fuck journal. The April 7 entry, which moves from prose to verse, concludes, "I'm still here and I wish I wasn't. Sick of this life. Every day is another kind of loss." The loss that Flanagan reports in his journals, registered in the 1970s but helplessly disorganizing by the 1990s, is the loss of masochism. In a piece titled S, published in the magazine Framework, along with photos by Rose, Flanagan tracks the minutiae of his breathing to narrate this loss. You'll notice I have the letter S carved into the right side of my chest. It might seem strange and kind of silly for a grown man to risk infection and permanent scarring, not to mention the pain, and allow someone to carve an S into his flesh like this, but I'm serious about it. I have an S on my chest, and I feel sentimental about it. It was put there by Sheree, my soulmate, sex partner, and sidekick for the past 12 years. It's her signature, S for Sheree, and mine too, S for slave, which is what I am, or what I always aspired to be, except that now I'm not so sure. This S, which used to be the symbol of strength and stamina, has started fading. There's an S on my chest, and that's what it stands for, sick. These days when we have sex, or when I have sex by myself, or forget sex when I'm just climbing up the stairs or doing anything that produces a physical strain of some sort, I get severely short of breath and have to stop everything, gasping like a fish, while I suck air through my nose and then inhale slowly through clenched teeth, making this swooshing sound with my mouth, like I'm telling someone, "Shh, be quiet," but I'm just trying to save my breath. Flanagan's labored breathing speaks for him. Breathing here opposes physical exertion, including the exertion of actual speech, in the absence of strength and stamina. Underdog, a piece that is not attached to any specific project, amplifies breathing's negation. So this is a quote, "No is the first word that comes out of my mouth. It's part of my breathing now. No, no, no." Flanagan here performs what François Bernard Michel, writing about asthma in French literature, describes as disabled language's refusal of air. Michel writes of advanced asthmatics, "Pour exister, ils n'ont plus que leurs symptômes, sorry, I mixed two languages. Pour exister, ils n'ont plus que leurs symptômes. To keep living, they possess little more than their symptom." Likewise, Flanagan's existence becomes structured by asphyxia, which in Michel's nomenclature is a miming of death by life. The Pain Journal from 2000, Flanagan's second published journal and last work, is his most explicit and most substantial postscript on his and Rose's BDSM life and work. Flanagan wrote the Pain Journal between December 27, 1994 and December 16, 1995. The entries chronicle the everydayness of a pain that no longer catalyzes pleasure and gratification. Intentional episodic pain gives way to unintentional chronic pain. Flanagan never had the luxury of non-conscious breathing. He never tried to become aware of his breathing. Instead, in his performances with Rose, he tried to cultivate an awareness of breathing that differed from the one that is tied to cystic fibrosis. This cultivation becomes impossible in the Pain Journal, where CF determines the terms by which he's made aware of his respiration. At that point, Flanagan starts hating his and Rose's performance work, finds it pathetic, is embarrassed by it. The spectacular shock of the couple's BDSM performances dissipates. What remains is difficulty, which is Jennifer Doyle's term for art that combines intimacy, exposure, and explicitness. In his March 19, 1995 entry, Flanagan situates his masochistic identity in the past. "Thought I'd escape writing tonight, but found myself mulling over why it is I don't like pain anymore. I have this performance to do on April 1st, and I'm shying away from doing or having SM stuff done to me because pain and the thought of pain mostly just irritates and annoys me rather than turns me on. But I miss my masochistic self. I hate this person I've become, and what about my reputation?" Further into the journal, on November 8, 1995, Flanagan describes the fading of masochism as a betrayal. a stratagem that did not operate as long as needed. I set it up so that pain was supposed to be good, something to endure and to conquer, he deplores. Anything of that feels like a failure. According to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, the predicted life expectancy for people with CF born between 2015 and 2019 is around 46 years. When Flanagan wrote the journal, the average lifespan was closer to 29 or 30 years old. So at 42, as Flanagan observes, I'm one of the anomalies. The speaker of the poem Dead Air resents having to save his breath or survive to appease his audience in his addressee, Rose in all likelihood. The poem's title, which refers to an interruption of the video signal during a television broadcast, entangles the failure to entertain with a breath that heralds death. That's all that's there. But what do you care? I'm wasting my breath, waiting for death, choking on my own flame, saving it all for them, the audience, and you. The rhyme scheme, AABBCCD, is so simple as to recall nursery rhymes. The movement from wasting to waiting and breath to death is predictable. If we were to fill in the blank, we would probably come up with the same words. Dead air accomplishes little by way of figuration. The poetic toolbox is as depleted as the poet who holds it. For Flanagan, surviving feels like failure because it means outliving masochism and hence falling short of deriving a sense of self-control from the experience of pain. Although Flanagan feels alienated from his and Rose's BDSM performance work in the Pain Journal, the book itself unfolds as a kind of endurance performance. Before meeting Flanagan, Rose had studied psychology at Cal State Northridge, where she'd become familiar with therapeutic techniques associated with New Age. In a personal journal from the fall of 1977, she details her discovery of hypnosis and self-hypnosis, which she deems a valuable learning tool. She recalls serving as a subject in a demonstration of Neo-Reichian techniques. Around the same time, she became involved with Radix, which is a body therapy collective. When Rose and Flanagan met in the early 1980s, she introduced him to body work, and he introduced her to BDSM play. The therapeutic and theatrical techniques that they taught one another influenced the Pain Journal. In order to pursue his project despite suffering, Flanagan had to remain disciplined, follow the rules, and be a good boy. Whereas Flanagan and Rose's BDSM performances employed knives, nails, and ball gags, his journal writing was contingent on other aids like masks, respirators, and oxygen pumps. Flanagan's writing in the Pain Journal is loopy and ongoing. His inability to catch his breath translates into lengthy sentences like this one. This is one sentence. Excuse me while I put my earplugs because Sheree's asleep and breathing heavy, and that really bugs me because I want her up and talking to me and watching TV with me now that it's 1 in the morning and I'm awake and the picture of Dorian Gray is on TV after she came down and woke me up after I left her upstairs sleeping on the couch after her long day, long drive from home from Irvine. But never mind that, I was pissed that she wasn't watching a TV show about a murder in our own Rampart district and then some dumb movie about a Terminator substitute teacher blowing kids away while she snored away, and I had a bunch of things I wanted to tell her, but it wasn't only that she was asleep. I was depressed and out of breath, and I could barely talk anyway, but I stormed away with my stupid fashion pack, drug pump slung over my shoulder like a huffy bitch, short of breath and with a headache, like a penned-up rodeo horse trying to kick its way out of my head. Everyone who's critical of my nastiness put a plastic bag on your head all day, and every couple hours, slam your head into the coffee table and press your thumbs into your eye sockets until your eyeballs squish like bloody grapes, and then tell me what a great mood you're in. The sequence of conjunctions, like and, offers no respite. Flanagan doesn't hierarchize his claims. His long sentence is filled with digressions, some of which we are belatedly asked to disregard. Morning is misspelled, but Flanagan never pauses to make corrections. Rose's noisy breathing, addressed at the beginning of the sentence, is only a distant memory by the time we get to the end, and Flanagan's own difficult breathing has taken over. He's short of breath, out of breath, and a huffy bitch. Here and throughout the Pain Journal, Flanagan's writing succumbs to the respiratory repertoire of CF. to wheezing, coughing, being out of breath, and breathing in a way that feels like drowning. Flanagan's practice of writing with difficult breathing is therapeutic, which might seem like a counterintuitive statement. It bears proxy libidinal structures, including boredom and humour, which make his defenselessness less disorganizing in the absence of masochism. Bored is how Flanagan feels as he translates into journal entries the humdrum of not breathing, yet not dying. Across his entries included in the Pain Journal, Flanagan repeats that his chest hurts, that he can't breathe, and that he's wheezing and coughing. He's not depressed, but not happy, just alive, just living, barely breathing. Again, he sums up, I'm boring myself. Nowhere is Flanagan's wariness of his recursing symptomatology clearer than in the July 21st, 1995 entry. I don't know what to write in here anymore. The same old story every night. Headache, blah, blah, blah. Hospital, blah, blah, blah. Can't breathe, blah, blah, blah. Dying, blah, blah, blah. TV, blah, blah, blah. Sheree, blah, blah, blah. Mom and dad, blah. Tim, blah. Stupid brother John, blah, blah. Letters to write, blah, blah, blah. Camp, blah. My penis, blah, blah. List, keeping, and blah, blahs. A poor substitute for real writing. Blah, 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 blah. Not enough painkillers, blah, blah. But if the breathing's bad enough on Monday, Riker might up the pain meds because what have we got to lose? Blah, blah, blah. Blood in my flang, blah, blah. Vital signs, not so, blah, blah. Vital, no change, no up, no down, blah, blah. Lost in the blah, blah and the pain med. But the pain's still here and there's no rush anymore, blah, blah, blah. Wah, wah, why won't this nurse clean out my flang basin? Ha, 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 this is so awful, I don't deserve to live, blah. Flanagan's same old story here is overwritten. Onomatopoeia substitute for markers of relation in punctuation. Wah evokes an infantile cry, and ha, sighing or wheezing. Generic sound words that perform difficult breathing convey Flanagan's boredom in the face of recalcitrant symptoms. In his July 14, 1995 entry, Flanagan casts himself as a boring type. He says, Sheree and I are supposed to be fucking, but I'm snoring and she's boring. Snoring and boring, thank you, ladies and germs. Flanagan and Rose were supposed to remain Mistress Rose and Supermasochist, but now they're snoring and boring. A non-conscious habit and an affective state here congeal as types that bring to mind clowns or characters on a children's TV show. Fashioning himself as a type organizes Flanagan. It sets expectations about gestures and behaviors. By calling himself boring with a capital B, Flanagan is in a sense saying, my shtick is that I complain a lot about not being able to breathe. Perhaps Flanagan can't stand the boredom, but boredom here does coextend with a set of expectations that ensure his continuity as a subject. The boring repetition with little difference of Flanagan's labored breathing does not lead anywhere, but it holds the mood. I derived this formulation from Adam Phillips's notion of boredom as that state of suspended anticipation in which things are started and nothing begins, the mood of diffuse restlessness which contains that most absurd and paradoxical wish, the wish for a desire. Boredom for Phillips makes tolerable the experience of waiting for something without knowing what it could be. As a blank condensation of psychic life, boredom holds the mood, keeping alive at one remove the possibility of desire. Phillips' allusion to holding refers to Winnicott's holding environment. Boredom is not an end in itself, it's a transitional prehesitation, a stage that comes before the mental conflict or the asthma, as Winnicott himself calls it, of letting feelings develop. Flanagan's boredom differs an asthma-like experience of psychic disorganization by holding and holding on to CF's respiratory patterns and rhythms. Flanagan's transition from extreme performance to boring writing isn't so surprising in light of Jennifer Doyle's argument that once we set aside concerns of repression and censorship, we may perceive in sexually explicit art the quotidian cycles of desire, anti-heroic portraits of anxiety, pleasure, rage, and boredom. From BDSM performances emerged a boredom that in the Pain Journal, Flanagan harnesses as a survival mechanism, one that gets him from one place to another, from one day to the next. Boredom recasts crisis as a new normal, a new business as usual that ironically turns chronic pain into medication by postponing a loss of personal identity. In the manuscript of his ambitious Book of Medicines, Flanagan recalls writing in 1979 when he was new to BDSM relationships. I'm excited again just thinking about it, but I have to slow down now. I've got to stretch this out for a long time. I'm going to make it a lifestyle and not just a mood. A mood, boredom, returns when excitement as lifestyle becomes too onerous. The drawn-out temporality of sustained desire or catexis makes way for the dragged-out temporality of deferred catexis. Writing the pain journal might have been boring for Flanagan, but I don't find the experience of reading his jittery prose strictly boring. When I read, I alternate between the boredom of going over the symptomatology of CF for the 9th time and the shock of witnessing persistent suffering. I also alternate between the desire to rush to the end of the book and the impulse to slow down in a pathetic bid to postpone Flanagan's inevitable death. These contradictory feelings amount to what Sian Nai calls stuplimity, an affective structure that begins with the dysphoria or shock of shock and boredom and culminates in something like the open feeling of resisting being, an indeterminate affective state that lacks the punctuating point of an individuated emotion. To illustrate stuplimity, Nye considers, among other modernist works, Samuel Beckett's Stirring Still. Her account of Beckett's final prose work resonates uncannily with the Pain Journal. Nye writes, "The theme of survival and endurance in the wake of a traumatic loss is conveyed here through a drastic slowdown of language, a rhetorical enactment of its fatigue, in which the duration of relatively simple actions is uncomfortably prolonged through a proliferation of precise inexactitudes." We encounter Flanagan's painful breathing through the repetition of these precise inexactitudes, from sound words to erratic syntax. The more Flanagan's language collapses into labored breathing, the more indistinguishable breathing and writing components appear. As hinted by a phrase like "thank you, ladies and germs," that plays with the format of stand-up comedy, boredom doesn't cancel out the vibrant humor that typifies Flanagan's work alone and with Rose. Flanagan borrows the phrase "ladies and germs" from the late comedian Milton Berle, who would say to his audience, "Good evening, ladies and germs, I mean ladies and gentlemen, I call you ladies and gentlemen, but you know what you really are." Flanagan's comedy relies on musicality. In the documentary Sick, Flanagan prefaces a song that borrows the tune of Mary Poppins' Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious with a warning. So I'm going to play this song for you.
Start humming the tune to Supercalifragilistic. So I wrote this song. And I know the Disney people, if any Disney people are here, they will probably tell me to cease and desist, and believe me, I will, but not yet. In my own time. Supermasochistic, cystic fibrosis. He should have died when he was young, but he was too precocious. How much longer he will live is anyone's prognosis. Supermasochistic, cystic fibrosis. I'm gonna die. I'm the little and I'm gonna die. I'm the little, I'm gonna die. I'm the little, I'm gonna die. When he was born, the doctor said he had this bad disease. It gave him awful stomach aches and made him cough and wheeze. Any normal person would have buckled from the pain, but Super Bob got twisted, now he's into whips and chains. I'm the little, I'm gonna die. And you get the idea of that before I kill myself. I'm the little, I'm gonna die. 40 years have come and gone, and Bob is still around. He's tied up by his ankles and he's hanging upside down. A lifetime of infection, and his lungs all filled with phlegm. The CF would have killed him if it weren't for S&M. Oh, supermasochistic, cystic fibrosis. Supermasochistic, cystic fibrosis. Supermasochistic, cystic fibrosis. Supermasochistic, cystic fibrosis.
Even if the journal does not contain actual songs like the one that we just heard, Flanagan pays close attention to moments where prose turns into a melody. For instance, in the June 1st, 1995 entry, his symptomatology turns to air, labored breathing, at the same time as it turns into an air, a melody from the sound of music. Feel awful, neck ache, headache, sore eyes, chest pain, difficulty breathing. These are a few of my favorite things. In musical theater, transitions from colloquial speech to conventional musical numbers mark moments of dramatic tension or exacerbated emotion. Think of the I Want song, which early in a show clarifies the protagonist's motivations, or the 11 o'clock number, which just before the finale raises the stakes of the play. By contrast, musical structure in the pain journal diffuses tension. It distracts. It allows the masochism evacuated from a pain that plainly hurts to return. When Flanagan no longer derives pleasure from pain alone, he finds himself adrenalized by the clever writing and magical writing that he deciphers in his manuscript on pain. Whether they are boring or comedic, Flanagan's therapeutic self-encounters rely on his artistic production. They hinge on Flanagan's ability to interpret symptoms arranged into a hum, a melody, or even a joke as evidence of his persistence as a subject. Flanagan stopped writing only 3 weeks before he died on July 4th, 1996. Ever since Flanagan's death, Rose has been aware of her breathing in intentionally and unintentionally triggered situations of exertion that have doubled as occasions for memorialization. Rose recounts a hiking trip up to the Himalayas, where at a high altitude she felt so close to Flanagan because of the physical thing she was feeling with the breathing. She adds, and that of course made me cry all the more because I never realized how difficult it was for him. Of course, it's hard to imagine that Rose never realized how difficult it was for Flanagan to breathe. She had to be sharply attuned to his symptoms in order for the pair to engage in BDSM. But Rose's encounters with breathing following Flanagan's passing have likely intensified this kind of attunement. She has sought to preserve this awareness in everyday and artistic performances. Yoga, which she has been practicing in Los Angeles and in Yogaville, Virginia, has given her the opportunity to meditate on the breath of life and the idea that you're only allowed so many breaths. She says, I think about Bob a lot during yoga because he could never deep breathe. He never had a comfortable breath. In an outtake from the interview just quoted, Rose adds that even watching her granddaughter breathe reminds her that Bob could never take a decent breath. In Corpse Pose and Gurney of Nails, 2 stage performances, Rose occupies the position of the fakir that would have been Flanagan's in their BDSM performances. She lies on a table or a bed of nails and remains stoic for approximately 45 minutes as collaborators paint her body or pour hot wax onto her. For these performances, she consciously tries to make her breath as narrow, as skinny as she can, and barely breathe at all. Rose here works with breathing to re-encounter herself in proximity to Bob or as Bob. In 1995, shortly after Flanagan died, Rose was invited to Tokyo to present relics of some of the couple's collaborations. She decided instead to create a new installation called Bubaloon, a 20-foot inflatable depiction of Flanagan, complete with erect penis, piercings, ball gag, and straitjacket. Rose's choice to memorialize with an inflatable structure a person whose lungs were filled with flame isn't as ironic as it appears. With Bubaloon, Rose inflated Flanagan in the most literal sense, but even as she immortalized him, she made sure not to subtract one of his defining characteristics, his inability to breathe well. If Bubaloon could breathe, if it let out the air that it let in, it would deflate. I'll end here, but I'll look forward to having a conversation. Thank you very much.